From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
The most sacred church in all of Christianity was closed for 3 days this week. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem was shuttered by the Christian leaders in the Holy Land to protest Israeli plans to tax and even seize Christian property. We talked to someone who was just there and saw the closing of the doors. And then the Vatican released a new letter about some very old heresies. We get the latest from Vatican correspondent Edward Pentin. I'm Jeanette DeMelo, editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register and co-host of Register Radio.
And I'm Matthew Bunson, the Register senior editor and co-host for Register Radio. Well, Pelagianism, Gnosticism, names that loom out of the shadows of church history, but that are still very real today. And Pope Francis is worried about both in the world today. And the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has issued a statement about both.
But first, this week we saw a huge controversy about an Israeli proposal to tax Christian businesses in Jerusalem and to even claim properties sold by the church. The Christian community closed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in protest, and it opened 3 days later after the government and Christian leaders agreed to negotiate over the taxes. So joining us today is Dr. Tom McGovern, who just contributed a commentary to the Register on the Passion. He's also the co-host of a local radio show called Dr. Doctor for Redeemer Radio, an EWTN affiliate in the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. And Dr. McGovern, you were on a visit to the Holy Land last week.
Yes, I was. I just returned Tuesday, and on Saturday night, my 17-year-old daughter and I got to experience a lock-in in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is something a lot of people aren't aware of.
So what is the lock-in?
Well, a lock-in is not something accidental. It's something planned, and about 15 Catholics and about 5 Orthodox each night can sign up with their respective churches to be locked in when they close the doors at 7 and the Muslim key holder closes the door. So we were standing inside Saturday evening before the Sunday noon closure, and you watch the door close, you hear the Muslim man with the keys do his thing, and then there's a little square door within the large door, and you see a ladder come in that he uses to lock the door, and it sits inside the church until they open it the next day. And while you are locked in, you have free reign to roam and pray wherever you want to within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Most people spend a great deal of time on Calvary. We also get to spend time in the empty tomb, praying on the very slab where Jesus' body was laid. And in fact, we just saw that they had uncovered some tombs from within a few years of Jesus that have not been used since the 40s A.D., just behind the edicule where the tomb is held. It was a fascinating find, and it was a wonderful night on Calvary.
That is incredible. I have not been there. Matthew, have you?
I have.
So describe, first of all, what is the Holy Sepulchre, and describe this location and what is believed to be there.
The Holy Sepulchre is the church which holds what we fully believe to be Calvary, where Jesus was crucified, and the empty tomb. And, of course, Calvary is really poor limestone remains from a limestone quarry. If you look in Jerusalem, virtually every building is made of white limestone. And you continue to quarry limestone while the blocks come out nice and solid. But when it starts to crumble, you leave behind the bad stone. And so literally, the stone that the builders in Jerusalem rejected did become the cornerstone of our faith, the place of the crucifixion. And St. Helena, around the year 330 A.D., found this site, uncovered it from the Romans having buried it, and established a church there, which was then subsequently destroyed by the Persians in 614 and rebuilt again and then destroyed by a Muslim leader and then built again. And that church now is run by several different groups, the Greek Orthodox, the Roman Catholics, the Armenians are the most prominent among them.
It's really a tremendous place, and I am fascinated this story, which of course it's terrible that it was closed for for pilgrims who were trying to visit this site. But it's remarkable. It was closed for 3 days. I found that to be quite interesting, given what this location is. But can you tell us a little bit more about the controversy that unfolded there this week?
Well, Friday afternoon, our pilgrim group was with one of the auxiliary bishops of the Latin Patriarchate, who told us that the threat of taxing church properties, and they said it would not be where there were actual worship spaces, depending how they define that, but if they taxed them, many religious communities said they would simply have to leave the Holy Land and abandon those sites, because some of the most expensive land in the world is actually in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. We were just told that day that an apartment that included an entire floor in the Mamilla region of Jerusalem, just outside the old walled city, was costing $10 million. And so to pay taxes on land that is that valuable would be impossible for the church, and would really lead to those who take care of the holy places and those communities which are keeping Christianity alive there, it would force them to move. So we were aware of that the day before. On Friday, Saturday morning, our group had Mass on Calvary. Saturday night, we were locked in. Sunday, we were at Abu Ghosh in Palestine having Mass at this old Crusader church when we heard the news that they had just locked the doors.
So you basically went from a lock-in to a lockout.
You got that exactly right, Matthew.
And what, in your conversations with the different Christian groups that I know you encounter on a pilgrimage like this, what were some of the reactions to the news that the Holy Sepulchre had been closed, not to mention just within your own group?
They all saw it as a necessary thing that might hurt, but they thought it was their best way to nonviolently confront this very unfair issue that seems to be a wholesale targeting of Christians. It's as I learn more about the history of modern Israel, it just seems like one more move to try to rid the land of those who are not Jewish. And the modern state of Israel seems to pride itself on being a place of freedom for Christians, but with actions such as these, it seems like it's trying to clear the decks for a Jewish-only state. At least that's the impression that many have. And of course, on both sides of the wall, both in Palestine and in Israel, the Christians are treated as second-class citizens, either by Muslims on the Palestine side or by Jews on the Israel side.
And there's also the added complexity of this bill that was being proposed in the Knesset that would be allowing for the seizure or the expropriation of properties that the churches had been selling as part of this very complex idea of leases for 99 years and other things. Were they talking about that as well?
The auxiliary bishop did not. Our tour guide, who is a Palestinian Catholic who grew up and still lives in the old city, was talking about that. He was saying this was going to more affect the Orthodox Church than the Catholic Church. And that was something that I honestly need to learn more about. But he said even this, the local Christians saw this as a definite targeting of Christians to try to remove them and their land from the area. Because once a Christian sells land to the Jews or Muslims, they never get it back because those groups do not want to sell to Christians.
So, Dr. McGovern, you have obviously spent some time in the Holy Land.
Yes, this was my third trip.
Oh, that's really wonderful. Recently, you wrote several Lenten pieces for the Register on the Passion. What have you been working on?
I've been giving talks on the Passion for the last over 30 years, but actually Matthew, my friend, asked me several years ago to write a course for Catholic Distance University, so I revisited everything I thought I knew about the Passion from one of my mentors in medical school at Mayo Clinic, and found out, after researching the history and the Latin and Greek back to about 600 BC, that much of it was mistaken. And I uncovered a lot of fascinating things that I don't want to spoil on the radio, but I'll answer questions like, did Christ really die of suffocation, or did any crucifixion victim die of suffocation, which has been greatly propounded by my mentor, Dr. William Edwards, who was a pathologist at Mayo Clinic. But I put together art history, ancient inscriptions, ancient graffiti, Latin and Roman writings, and medical research to try to put together more realistically what it is that Christ really endured for us.
Very interesting stuff, though, because you make note in your article about the myths of the crucifixion. And these are images that are, of course, advanced in film and even in books. But what was, just to give everyone a tease, what was the one that you most remember of all of the myths?
Well, one of them that strikes me is that we grow up looking at crucifixes. So because we've seen something so many times, we think that's the way it was done. But as one example, there's only one archaeologic piece of evidence for crucifixion, and that was a heel bone found about a mile north of the Damascus Gate in an ancient Jewish cemetery from someone who died the same century as Jesus did. And this nail is pounded sideways through the heel bone, not through the front of the foot, but sideways. And it didn't break the bone. But if you look at ancient graffiti that was made of crucifixion during the time it was legal, if you look at ancient gemstones, which were made of Jesus on the cross during the time it was legal, all of them show the heels on the side of the cross. And yet, no crucifix ever shows that. Many crucifixes show one foot on top of the other, which would have been tremendously difficult to do, but guess what? No crucifix ever showed that until around 1,000 years after Christ. In fact, it's not until at least 800 or 900 years after Christ that they even show him dead on the cross. They all show him alive on the cross before that. The first religious image of Jesus on the cross is not until 420 A.D., over 100 years after crucifixion was abolished. So whoever made that image didn't talk to somebody who ever saw a crucifixion. So that's one of the images that was very striking.
This is really fascinating stuff. We could go on for another whole segment, but our time is up.
I think we'll have to have you back.
Yes, indeed. So
I get that.
I look forward to sharing what you've written on the Passion with our audience in just a few weeks. But thank you so much, Dr. McGovern, for being with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
When we come back, we're joined by Edward Pentin on the new papal document about ancient heresies. More when we return.
Father Wade Menezes talks about the National Catholic Register.
As the National Catholic Register celebrates its 90th anniversary, I think that says a lot about the publication. It works. It's solidly Catholic. It presents the teachings of the Church, unabashedly so, and also guides its readers to be even more solidly Catholic themselves. One of the major effects that I think the Register has on its readers is that it elevates the intellect. Whether it be a faith item or a news item, it presents the news and the faith item in a very balanced way. One thing that the Register can never be accused of is being too far left or too far right. It is solidly Catholic, right in line with the Chair of Peter. And I think that says a lot about the Register. For a 6-issue free trial of the National Catholic Register, go to ncregister.com and click on the 6 free issue banner, or call 800-421-3230 for your 6 free issues. And as you await your first issue, enjoy some of our online content.
Divine Intimacy Radio.
When you engage with the wisdom of saints this way, it stokes the fires of God in our hearts, encourages us, strengthens us, and gives us wisdom to deal with the difficulties of life. It also gives us wisdom that allows us to rise above all of the junk, to live with joy and peace in the midst of even the most difficult circumstances.
Divine Intimacy Radio, Sunday, 6:30 a.m., 1:30 p.m., and 11 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Whether you're at home, at work, in the car, you can follow what he teaches 24 hours each day. We're EWTN Radio.
And just to let you know, I'm a returning Catholic because of EWTN. Bless you guys and keep it up.
And you're invited to visit our website too. Just log on to www.ewtn.com. That's www.ewtn.com.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
Welcome back. I'm Jeanette DeMelo, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register.
And I'm Matthew Bunson, Senior Editor of the Register and co-host of Register Radio. Well, in a document for bishops published this week, the Vatican has drawn attention to the dangers that two very old heresies pose for modern culture. Entitled Placuit Deo, or In His Goodness, from the first few words from the name of the encyclical, and approved by Pope Francis, the letter is intended to demonstrate, as they write, certain aspects of Christian salvation that can be difficult to understand in today's culture. It centers on the heresies of Neopelagianism and Neo-Gnosticism, which I know is a bit of a mouthful, which the document asserts are two contemporary schools of thought rooted in the past heresies of Pelagianism and Gnosticism, and which have often been mentioned in speeches and homilies by Pope Francis. We're joined by Edward Pentin, Register Vatican correspondent, for a full report. Edward, welcome back.
Hi, good to be with you again.
Well, I have to ask the opening question first. Have you thawed out from all of the snow?
Yes, that took us all by surprise. But amazingly enough, I've never known it this cold before, and there's still snow on the ground. So it's a lot of getting used to here for a lot of Romans who aren't used to this sort of thing. But
it was a beautiful sight.
It was. I mean, Rome's beautiful in whatever season, but especially under the snow, it was quite something. Yeah.
Well, Edward, why did the Vatican decide that it was necessary to publish this letter to the world's bishops?
Well, this is a theme which the Pope Francis has talked about quite often, about these two heresies, ancient heresies, which are now kind of been updated, and they're now sort of connected with today's cultural changes, as they describe it in the letter. And really, I think it wasn't actually the Pope's initiative. This letter actually came from theologians who asked the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to write something about this in order to to give bishops and to give the faithful a means of really understanding these heresies and to try and deal with them and to make sure that the faithful don't fall into the traps of thinking that salvation is available in a different way apart from Christ. And that's essentially it. I mean, these two theories, these two heresies are, as I say, quite ancient, but they're coming back, as Pope Francis thinks, and so he wanted that dealt with.
Let me jump in on that ancient part of it, and Edward, I'm going to let you off the hook for a second, because we have a historian in the house, a church historian in the house, and of course that's Matthew Bunson, Dr. Matthew Bunson. And so I think the best person here to try to describe really what Pelagianism is and Gnosticism is, the original heresies, that's you, Matthew. So please give us a good sense of what these two heresies were.
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, Pelagianism, which flourished briefly in the 4th century, was a heresy that proposed that you could actually save yourself, that it was possible to find salvation without grace, without Christ. And Gnosticism, which is actually arguably one of the very earliest of the heresies in the Church, had to do with secret knowledge, but it also has that separation of spirit and body. And the ramifications for people today are pretty obvious when you think about it, because if the body's a mere instrument of the mind, it means you can pretty much do anything you want with it. So you can find Gnostic ideas in things like transgenderism and transhumanism and even abortion and euthanasia.
Interesting. But those aren't the things really that this document points to per se. So Edward, back to you. What are the neo forms of Pelagianism and Gnosticism that the document highlights? Can you give us some sense?
Well, the document explains Neo-Pelagianism as individuals who believe themselves to be radically autonomous. It's very much the sort of individualism that we see very much in the West
all
today.
Over.
And yes, and he says that for those who sort of follow this, they presume to be able to save themselves by their own strength, and that's very much connected with the old Pelagian heresy. They're unable to recognize that they derive from God and from others. And the letter says that such ways of thinking are incapable of welcoming the newness of the Spirit of God. So that's how the letter describes Neo-Pelagianism. Neo-Gnosticism, it describes as a model of salvation that is closed off in its own subjectivism. And it says that it consists of improving oneself, of being intellectually capable of reaching the mysteries of the unknown divinity without Christ. And such thinking presumes to liberate the human person from the body and the material universe, but fails to see the provident hand of God. It's very much, again, sort of thinking that one can sort of improve oneself and get to heaven really on one's own efforts without recognizing God's presence or need of God in the salvation of one's soul.
Is there a way, Edward, that we could sort of use the phrase that's so current today of, well, I'm spiritual but not religious? Does that kind of apply in a way to what these two heresies are proposing?
I think in a way it does. One thing that struck me, Matthew, when I read it was that in many ways it applies, I think, particularly to sort of lapsed Catholics who often don't see a need for the church, and they consider themselves Catholic, but they feel that, one's going to be saved anyway, so one doesn't have to go to church, and one doesn't really have to take things so seriously. And it's essentially they're saying, well, we can do it. We can be saved on our own without the need of Christ, or at least as the church teaches. And I think in many ways it deals with that, but also it deals with all kinds of you can't just pinpoint one group. I think it applies across the board of all of us, really, who have sort of elements of this probably within our own thinking. And it's just a sort of wake-up call to get the faithful back to really realizing what true salvation really means. And I think it explains that quite well in the document.
Now, the document itself seems to be very much aware, sort of informed of the fact that Francis has talked about both of these heresies quite a bit since almost the night of his election, hasn't he?
Yes, he has, and of course it figures in Evangelii Gaudium, and he's often raised it. I mean, the interesting thing I think also about this is that he often refers to Neoplatonism in the context of rigidity, and he's spoken about that often about not being too wrapped up with the rules of the church and doctrine, and sort of being led by the Spirit. But interestingly, this document doesn't really deal with that aspect of it. It doesn't deal with that really at all. It doesn't mention rigidity. It doesn't talk about those who might be rigidly adhering to doctrine and tradition. But it takes a much sort of broader view of the whole concept, and as we said earlier, really deriving it from the ancient Pelagian heresy.
What strikes me is how well will this be, understood by the Catholic in the pew. It's written, of course, to the bishops of the world, but there's a lot here that really could help the Catholic in the pew to guard against these heresies that really exist.
Yeah, but I also think it's kind of refreshing in a way for many people, I think, because often one's heard, a lot of documents coming out of the Vatican, they don't really talk about salvation much, and yet salvation is really the essence of what the church is about. I mean, that's what separates the church from any other kind of institution. And so I think people are quite pleased that this issue is being raised, and maybe, I don't know, but maybe the Vatican might consider putting it in a sort of bite-sized format where sort of the lay faithful who don't have knowledge of these concepts can really come to grips with them and understand exactly what the church means by this document in terms, just for the average layman who isn't a theologian and doesn't follow these things in such detail.
Well, I think there'll be a lot more exploration, I'm sure, of this document. I mean, part of the document was a response to the CDF document Dominus Jesus, which was out in 2000, and really affirmed the church's role, the Catholic Church's role in salvation. This doesn't seem, there was some worry about how this might treat that, but so far I haven't seen much commentary that really dissects exactly how it affects Dominus Jesus. But we'll get back to that at some other point. Before we let you go, I wanted to talk about the other news in Rome for the week, which is really the Council of Cardinals who met in Rome, the Council of 9 Cardinals. What were the main things emerging from their meeting this week?
Right. Well, there were two main issues that came up. One is they wanted to have a look at paragraph 32 of Evangelii Gaudium, which is Pope Francis' apostolic exhortation from 2013, which was kind of really a roadmap for his pontificate. And they picked out this paragraph because it talks about giving Episcopal conferences a certain doctrinal authority, or what it calls genuine doctrinal authority. And the Pope said in the document that's not yet been sufficiently elaborated. This is quite controversial because as we've seen with Amoris Laetitia, when different bishops' conferences have different interpretations, it's caused quite a lot of difficulty and controversy. And so what they're trying to do is to say, well, they're wanting to sort of decentralize doctrine in that way, but they're stressing that they want to highlight that the Lord is the one who safeguards the unity within the Church, and so basically we shouldn't be afraid of decentralizing in this area. And they also recommend rereading Pope John Paul II's Motu Proprio Apostolos Suos, which details the role of a bishop's conference. So they're trying to emphasize this continuity in that, but there is some concern about this.
And very quickly,
yes.
There was also more on sex abuse, which of course has dominated headlines related to the Pope recently.
Yes, and then they on this they discussed possible ways of speeding up cases being analyzed and investigated by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and they said that there's a possibility that regional tribunals could be set up to hear cases under the auspices and guidance of the congregation, the CDF. But that's just being discussed. There's nothing concrete on that. But that is one big concern about the issue, which is that the cases have been handled too slowly.
Well, very good, Edward. Thank you so much for always reporting from Rome. We need it, and we appreciate you.
Sure. Thanks for having me on again.
Remember, for more news, analysis, and commentary, check out the National Catholic Register at ncregister.com. Thanks for joining us here on Register Radio on EWTN. For Jeanette DeMelo, myself, and Matthew Bunson, and our producer, Jeff Burson, until next week, God bless.
For more information about the National Catholic Register and about Register Radio, go to ncregister.com. Podcasts of Register Radio are posted on ncregister.com and on EWTN.com. Join us next week at this time for Register Radio on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
The National Catholic Register is America's most complete Catholic news source with a comprehensive view of the world from a distinctly Catholic perspective. If it's shaping the world as we know it, you'll find it at ncregister.com.